Get away from that door.
Back? Not yet, Marbel. Winston, look at her. I looked down. My mother's hospital bracelet had gone soft and see-through in the rain. The pill bottles in her medicine bag had bled into ruined, illegible smears. Her lips had gone faintly blue at the edges. Celestine did not move from the doorway. I was protecting our home, she said. Not sorry, not shocked. Rehearsed, like she'd been waiting for the chance to say it. And for the first time in 11 years of marriage, I understood that my wife had an answer ready for everything.
Our home.
Even this. My name is Winston Smith. 5 weeks earlier, I thought I was bringing my mother home to heal. I did not know I was about to find out exactly what my wife had been hiding from me since the night my mother first walked through our door. That night would end up changing everything. My marriage, my mother's last years, and what I thought success meant. But that's still a few chapters away. Subscribe to see how this unfolds, and comment where you're watching from. I'd love to say hello and know how far our story is traveling. The call came at 6:47 in the morning, and I remember the time exactly because I was standing at my kitchen island, watching the coffee maker finish its cycle, thinking about nothing more important than a 9 o'clock meeting with 2 men who wanted to put my name on a building downtown. That was the kind of morning I was having. That was the kind of life I thought I was living. Then my phone rang, and a woman I'd never spoken to before introduced herself as a discharge coordinator at St. Augustine Medical Center, and she said my mother's name, the way strangers say names they've only ever seen typed on a clipboard, correctly, but without any weight behind it. Evelyn Smith, 71 years old, congestive heart complications, stabilized but fragile, cleared for discharge as of 8 a.m. And then the sentence that changed the shape of my entire week, my entire year, maybe my entire life, though I didn't know that yet. Sir, we have her listed as having no post-discharge care plan. Is there a family member who can take her in? I stood there with my coffee going cold in my hand, and I thought about the last time I'd visited my mother's apartment, 6 months ago, maybe 7, a fast lunch, and an even faster goodbye. My mind already back at the office, before I'd even pulled out of her parking lot. I thought about the space heater she kept running in December, because she said the building's heat came and went like a bad boyfriend. I thought about how I had a guest wing in my house, bigger than her entire apartment, sitting empty, except for the housekeeper's twice-a-week dusting. Yes, I said. I'll take her in. I'm coming now. I didn't call Celestine first. I want to be honest about that, because everything that happened afterward, every question I've had to ask myself since, starts right there in that decision. I didn't call my own wife to tell her my mother was coming to live with us. I told myself it was because there wasn't time, because Evelyn needed to be picked up within the hour, because some decisions a man just has to make with his chest instead of a committee. But if I'm being truthful, and I promised myself, somewhere around the time I found my mother standing in the rain, that I would start being truthful, even when it costs me, I think some part of me already knew what Celestine would say if I asked her first. I think I called it decisiveness, because I didn't want to call it what it really was, which was fear of my own wife's answer. The drive to the hospital took 40 minutes, and felt like 4 hours. I kept picturing my mother the way she'd been at Christmas, laughing at something on the television, waving off my offer to fix her leaking faucet, because a woman who raised 4 children by herself can fix her own sink, Winston. I did not picture what I actually found when I walked into that hospital room. She looked smaller. That's the first thing that hit me. Not sicker, not older, just smaller, like the illness had taken up residence somewhere inside her chest and pushed everything else in toward the middle. She was sitting on the edge of the bed in a thin cotton gown, an old gray cardigan pulled over her shoulders that I recognized because I'd bought it for her at least a decade ago, back when I still had time to notice things like what sweater she needed. Beside her on the mattress sat a small clear plastic bag of orange pill bottles and a manila folder of discharge papers, and that was it. That was everything she had with her. No suitcase, no overnight bag. A woman who had raised 4 children and buried a husband and worked double shifts until her knees gave out. And all she had in the world in that moment fit into 2 hands. Winston. She said my name like she wasn't sure whether to be relieved or embarrassed, and I hated that I'd ever let her feel like calling her own son for help was something to be embarrassed about. "I'm here, Ma." I crossed the room, and I didn't say anything else for a second, because I was afraid of what my voice would do if I tried. I just took the bag of medicine from her hands, so she wouldn't have to carry it, and I helped her stand, and I felt how light she'd become, how her arm through mine felt like something that could break if I wasn't careful, and something cracked open in my chest that I hadn't let myself feel in years, the particular guilt of a son who built himself a mansion while his mother sat alone in a 1-bedroom apartment, waiting for a phone call that came less and less often. "You don't have to do this," she said in the car, watching the city go by out the window, like she still expected me to change my mind at any moment. Like a man might decide halfway through a drive that his mother wasn't worth the trouble after all. "I can go to my sister's. Dolores has a pull-out couch." "Dolores has a pull-out couch and 3 cats and a 4th-floor walk-up," I said. "You're not climbing 4 flights of stairs with your heart the way it is. You're coming home with me." End of discussion. She was quiet for a while after that, and when I glanced over, I saw she was crying, not the loud kind of crying, but the kind that just leaks out the corners of a person's eyes when they're too tired to hold it back anymore. "I just didn't want to be a burden to you and Celestine," she said. "You two have your life." I reached over and took her hand, the same hand that used to smack the back of my knuckles when I reached for dessert before dinner, the same hand that had signed report cards and permission slips and, later, a loan co-signature for my very first business, back when no bank in the city would touch a 24-year-old black man with a business plan and nothing else. "Ma, look at me," I said. And she did, finally. "You are never going to be a burden to me. Not now, not ever. You are the reason I have anything at all. I don't care what it takes. You are going to stay in my house, and you are going to heal, and you are never going to feel alone again, as long as I'm breathing. I promise you that." I meant every word of it. I want that understood clearly, because in the weeks that followed, I would come dangerously close to breaking that promise, without ever meaning to, the way good men sometimes do, not through some single dramatic betrayal, but through 100 small silences, 100 moments of choosing not to see what was right in front of me, because seeing it would have required me to fight. And I had spent so many years of my life building a reputation for being a man who didn't need to fight, a man who could simply provide his way past any problem. I didn't understand yet that some problems can't be paid off. Some problems just need somebody willing to stand in the doorway and refuse to move. The house was quiet when we pulled into the circular drive, all that pale stone and glass catching the morning light, and I remember looking at it through my mother's eyes, for what felt like the first time in years, not as an achievement, but as a place she'd never once been invited to simply exist in, only to visit for a few hours at a time, before I drove her home again, like a guest whose welcome had a built-in expiration. That was going to change today. I told myself that, as I helped her out of the car, as I carried her little bag of medicine bottles up the front steps myself, instead of leaving it to the staff, as I opened the door to the house I'd spent 20 years building and walked my mother through it for the first time, as something other than a visitor. I didn't know Celestine was standing at the top of the staircase, watching us come in, her face arranged into something that looked like a smile from a distance, but wasn't quite one up close. I didn't know that the woman I was about to bring home to heal was about to become, in the eyes of my own wife, a threat that needed managing. All I knew, standing in that doorway with my mother's arm looped through mine, was that I had finally done something right, something I should have done years earlier, and that no matter what came next, I was not going to let her feel unwanted in my home. Not for one single day. I should have known better than to make that kind of promise, without asking what my wife thought of it. But I was 30 years into loving my mother, and only 11 years into being married, and in that moment, The math of my loyalty hadn't caught up with the math of my life. It would. God, it would. But not yet. To understand why I would have carried my mother across broken glass if I'd had to, you have to understand who Evelyn Smith actually was before she was ever anybody's patient, before the hospital gowns and the discharge papers and the medicine bag that rattled every time she moved. You have to go back to a 2-bedroom apartment on the east side of the city, above a laundromat that never quite stopped humming, where a woman worked 2 and sometimes 3 jobs to keep 4 children fed and never once let any of us see her cry about it, not until years later, when I was old enough to understand what all that strength had actually cost her. My father died when I was 7. Heart attack, sudden, no warning, gone before the ambulance even made it 3 blocks. I remember almost nothing about the funeral, except my mother's hand gripping mine so tight it hurt, and I remember thinking even then, young as I was, that the tightness of her grip wasn't about comforting me. It was about holding herself together. She had 4 kids under the age of 12, and a husband's life insurance policy that barely covered the burial, and she had exactly one option in front of her, which was to become the kind of person who simply did not fall apart, because falling apart wasn't a luxury 4 children could afford to watch their mother indulge in. She cleaned office buildings, starting at 5 in the morning. She worked the register at a grocery store in the afternoons. Some years, when things were tightest, she took in ironing and ran a card table in our living room, like a small factory, pressing other people's church clothes late into the night, while a small black and white television played low in the background so she wouldn't fall asleep on her feet. I used to wake up sometimes at 2, 3 in the morning to get a glass of water, and I'd see the light still on under her door, still hear the hiss of that iron, and I never once heard her complain. Not once. I asked her about it years later, as a grown man, why she never let any of it show, and she told me something I've never forgotten. Complaining doesn't feed children, Winston. Working does. I saved my crying for after you were asleep. I found out much later. She never told me herself. My aunt let it slip at a family gathering, when I was already grown and successful, and had almost let myself forget the particulars of how I got that way, that there were whole stretches of my childhood where my mother went without eating, so the 4 of us could have full plates. There were winters where she wore the same coat for 6, 7 years, because a new one meant one of us went without shoes. She hid 2 hospitalizations from us when I was a teenager, because she didn't want us worrying about her, instead of focusing on school, checking herself out early both times against doctor's advice, because there was nobody else to make dinner, nobody else to make sure homework got done. And when I got into college, the first in our family to go anywhere past a high school diploma, she took on a 4th job, a cleaning shift on weekends at a hotel downtown, on top of everything else, because financial aid didn't cover everything, and she was determined that I was not going to drop out over a gap she could close with her own 2 hands. I didn't find out about that 4th job until my 2nd year, when I came home unexpectedly one Saturday and found her uniform hanging on the back of her bedroom door, and when I confronted her about it, crying, furious at myself for not noticing sooner, she just shrugged, like it was the most natural thing in the world. "You're going to be somebody, Winston," she said. I don't mind being tired for that. I built my entire career on the back of that sentence. Every deal I closed, every building I put my name on, every dollar I ever made, I made because a woman who had every reason to give up on herself decided instead to spend everything she had left on making sure her son never had to. And somewhere in the climbing, somewhere between the first small success and the mansion with the circular driveway, I let myself forget the specific weight of what she'd sacrificed. I remembered the story of it. I told the story of it, even at business dinners, dressed up as inspiration, as the humble beginnings chapter of my personal legend. But I had stopped feeling it. I had let gratitude curdle into a kind of comfortable, distant reverence, the way a man might admire a painting of his mother, instead of actually picking up the phone and asking how she was doing. That's who I brought home that morning. Not a burden, not an inconvenience. the architect of every single thing I owned, arriving at last in the house her sacrifices had built, carrying nothing but a bag of pills and a folder of discharge papers, because I had taken 30 years to finally understand what I owed her, and even then, I still didn't understand it fully enough to protect her from what was waiting inside my own front door. Celestine came down the staircase slowly, the way she moved when she was deciding how a moment was going to be performed before she'd even stepped into it, and by the time she reached the bottom step, her face had settled into something warm and welcoming, the kind of expression I'd watched her use on business partners' wives and charity gala committees for years. "Evelyn," she said, crossing the marble floor with her arms already open. "I am so glad you're here. This house has been missing a mother's touch. My mother, ever gracious, ever willing to believe the best of people, let herself be embraced, and thanked Celestine for opening your home to an old woman. And I stood there, watching the two of them, and let myself believe, for a moment, that everything was going to be fine." Celestine had the guest suite already prepared, she said. Fresh linens, a vase of flowers, extra pillows for elevation, because she'd read that helped with the swelling. She'd thought of everything, she said. She'd been planning this for days, ever since I'd texted her from the car that I was bringing my mother home. I found out only later that planning had meant something very different from what I assumed. I found out that the flowers were real, but the warmth behind them was not. That somewhere between my text message and my mother's arrival, Celestine had made a series of phone calls, not to prepare a room, but to research exactly how long a person in Evelyn's condition might realistically be expected to stay, and what, if anything, could be done to shorten that timeline. But I didn't know any of that yet. All I knew was that my wife had smiled and embraced my mother and called her house our home, and I let that smile do the work of convincing me that I had nothing to worry about. That first week, everything Celestine did in front of me was gracious. She sat with my mother during afternoon tea and asked about her childhood, her recipes, the names of her grandchildren, and my mother, starved for that kind of attention, that kind of being seen, bloomed a little under it, told stories I hadn't heard in years, laughed in a way I hadn't heard from her since before my father died. I remember thinking, watching them from the doorway one evening, that maybe I'd been wrong to worry at all. Maybe I'd built up some anxiety in my head about how my wife and my mother would get along that had nothing to do with reality. But I started to notice things. Small things. At first, the kind of things a man convinces himself he's imagining because the alternative is too uncomfortable to sit with. Celestine's warmth toward my mother was always loudest when other people were around. When the housekeeper was in the room, when we had guests, when there was an audience for the performance of a devoted daughter-in-law. But in the in-between moments, the quiet hours when it was just the three of us, or just the two of them, something colder crept in around the edges. I'd come home from the office and find my mother sitting alone in the guest suite, instead of in the living room where she'd been earlier, and when I asked her about it, she'd say only that she didn't want to be in the way, in a tone that made it clear someone had made her feel that way, without ever saying a single unkind word out loud. I overheard the first real crack about 10 days in. I'd come downstairs late for a glass of water, and heard Celestine on the phone in the kitchen, her voice low but not low enough, talking to her sister in a tone I'd never heard her use about my mother before. "I don't know how long I'm supposed to just live like this," she was saying. "There's a hospital bed, in my guest room, Denise. There's a walker parked by my front door, where the caterers park cars during the Hendersons' party. Do you know what it smells like in that wing now? Like a nursing home. I didn't sign up to run a nursing home." A pause. Then, colder. "No, I haven't said anything to Winston. You know how he gets about her. Guilt does something to that man's brain." I stood in that hallway for a long time after I heard that, my glass of water forgotten in my hand, feeling something shift in my chest that I didn't have a name for yet. I told myself it was one bad moment, one vented frustration to a sister, the kind of thing anybody might say when they're tired and adjusting to a change in their household. I didn't confront her about it that night. I told myself I was being a good husband by giving her grace, by not turning a private complaint into a public fight. Looking back now, I understand that what I actually did was give silence the first inch of ground it would need to eventually take the whole house. The complaints didn't stop. They just got quieter, more strategic, delivered in the tone of someone who was only ever raising a concern rather than making a demand. The medicine smell was bothering her migraines, she said. Could we maybe keep the door to Evelyn's room closed at all times? The walker scraped the hardwood, she said. Could we maybe find somewhere else to store it? The at-home nurse's visits 3 times a week were disruptive to her schedule, she said. Could we maybe consolidate them to fewer days? Each request sounded reasonable in isolation. Each one, stacked on top of the last, was slowly rearranging my mother into someone who had to ask permission to exist comfortably in her own son's home. Marbel noticed before I did. Marbel, who had kept our house running for 6 years by then, with a quiet competence I'd honestly stopped fully appreciating. The way you stop noticing the walls holding up a room you spend every day in. She'd worked for us long enough to read the temperature of a household, the way other people read weather. And about 2 weeks after my mother moved in, Marbel found a reason to catch me alone in the study, dusting a shelf that didn't need dusting, clearly working up to something. "Mr. Smith," she said, not quite looking at me. "Your mother left her lunch tray untouched again today. 3rd time this week. She's not hungry?" I asked, distracted, half my attention on the papers on my desk. "She's not sure she's allowed to ring for it," Marbel said carefully. Mrs. Voss mentioned to me that meals for the guest suite should be kept simple going forward. Said something about not wanting the kitchen turned into a hospital cafeteria. She hesitated. "I just thought you should know, sir. Your mother's too proud to ask twice for something she thinks is causing trouble." I sat with that for a long moment after Marbel left the room. I told myself I would talk to Celestine about it that evening. Calmly, reasonably, husband to wife. And I did. I want to be fair to myself about that much. I did bring it up over dinner, gently, the way a man raises a concern he's hoping will resolve itself without a real fight. Celestine's response was immediate and smooth, the kind of smooth that should have told me something on its own. "Of course she can have whatever she wants from the kitchen, Winston. I never said otherwise." Marbel must have misunderstood me. She reached over and squeezed my hand. "I only want what's best for this house. For all of us." I believed her. Or maybe it's more honest to say I chose to believe her, because believing her cost me nothing in that moment, and doubting her would have cost me a fight I didn't yet feel equipped to have. I had spent my whole life avoiding confrontation, building bridges instead of burning them, closing deals with charm instead of pressure, and some deep, unexamined part of me had married a woman who understood exactly how to use that instinct against me, without ever once raising her voice. Meanwhile, my mother grew smaller in the house, in every sense but the physical. She started eating in her room instead of joining us for dinner, said she was too tired, though I noticed she seemed plenty alert when it was just the two of us talking in the afternoons. She stopped mentioning the things Celestine had said to her, deflecting my questions with a tired smile and a change of subject, and I recognized that deflection, even though I didn't want to. It was the exact same deflection she'd used on me as a boy, whenever she didn't want me worrying about grown-up problems. My own mother was protecting me from the truth about my own wife, inside my own house, and some part of me let her, because it was easier than facing what the truth might mean. The cracks widened in ways I could no longer explain away as misunderstandings. I came home one afternoon to find the walker had been moved out of the front hall entirely, relocated to a storage closet near the garage, forcing my mother to make the long walk from her room to the kitchen, without it, whenever she wanted water in the middle of the day, because carrying it back and forth herself was more than her strength allowed, and asking someone to fetch it for her felt, she said, like too much trouble to cause. I found the nurse's visit schedule quietly changed on the household calendar, 3 visits a week reduced to 1, a change Celestine claimed the agency itself had made, due to staffing, a claim that turned out, when I called the agency directly, to be false. I found my mother's favorite chair, a small reading chair Celestine had actually bought for her the first week, part of that early performance of welcome, relocated from the sunroom, where my mother liked to sit and watch the birds at the feeder, back into the guest suite, where she could see nothing but a wall. Each incident on its own, Celestine had an answer for. Each answer was reasonable enough, delivered calmly enough, that arguing against it made me feel unstable, like I was the one being unreasonable, like I was picking fights over furniture and nurse schedules, instead of seeing the pattern that Marbel had already started to see, the pattern I was too close to, and too conflict-averse to name out loud even to myself. It was around this time, about 3 weeks after my mother's arrival, that I first noticed the change in Celestine that had nothing to do with my mother directly, a change in how she was managing our finances. I'd gone looking for a bank statement one evening, something simple, a routine check on an account I rarely paid close attention to, because Celestine had handled most of our household financial administration for years, a division of labor that had always seemed sensible, given how much of my own time went into the business. What I found instead, tucked behind a folder of unrelated paperwork in the small office off our bedroom that she used for household matters, was a manila envelope with my mother's name on it, not medical paperwork, but something else entirely. Property records. A deed, decades old, for a small parcel of land, out near the county line, that I'd never once heard my mother mention in my entire life. Attached to it, a handwritten note in Celestine's handwriting, several phone numbers, and the name of a real estate attorney I'd never heard of. I stood there in that little office, with that envelope in my hands, for a long time, feeling the ground under my understanding of my marriage shift in a way I couldn't yet name. Why did my wife have documents about a property belonging to my mother, a property my mother herself had apparently never mentioned to me? Why was there a real estate attorney's name attached to it? And why had all of this been hidden behind an unrelated folder instead of sitting openly on a desk, the way I would have expected any ordinary piece of family business to sit? I didn't confront her that night either. I told myself I needed more information first, that jumping to conclusions about my own wife over a folder of paperwork was exactly the kind of paranoid overreaction that could do real damage to a marriage if I was wrong. But I copied down the attorney's name before I put the envelope back exactly where I'd found it, and later that week, quietly, without telling Celestine, I asked Marbel, carefully, gently, in a way that wouldn't put her in an uncomfortable position, whether she'd noticed anything unusual happening around the house lately, beyond what she'd already told me about the meals and the walker. Marbel was quiet for a moment, the particular quiet of someone deciding how much loyalty they owed to which member of a household they served. Then she said, "Mr. Smith, there've been phone calls. Mrs. Voss takes them in the garden now, where the cameras don't reach, and the windows are far from the kitchen. Always the same time of day, always when you're at the office. I don't listen in, sir. That's not my place. But I've seen her come back inside from those calls, looking like she's just won an argument nobody else knew was happening." I felt something settle in my stomach, cold and heavy, the particular feeling of a man realizing that the story he's been telling himself about his own life might not be the true one. I thanked Marbel, told her I appreciated her honesty, and asked her, "I regret this now, though I understand why I did it, to keep what we'd just discussed between us for the time being, until I understood more clearly what I was actually looking at. I want to be honest about where my head was during those weeks, because it would be easy now, looking back, to make myself sound like a man who saw everything clearly and simply failed to act. That isn't the truth. The truth is messier than that. I saw pieces. I saw my mother growing smaller and quieter, in a house that was supposed to be her sanctuary. I saw my wife's warmth curdling into something colder whenever she thought no one important was watching. I saw a folder of documents I didn't understand, and a pattern of secretive phone calls that made my skin crawl, in a way I couldn't fully articulate even to myself. But I hadn't yet put those pieces together into the shape they were actually forming, because putting them together meant accepting a version of my marriage and a version of my wife that I wasn't ready to accept. I was a man who had spent 30 years building a life by refusing to see problems as anything bigger than they had to be. Celestine's coldness, I told myself, was stress. The documents were probably nothing, some old family matter my mother had simply never thought to mention. The phone calls were her business, whatever they were, and a good husband gave his wife privacy. I would keep telling myself versions of that story for 2 more weeks, right up until the night of the storm, right up until I came home with a bag of emergency medication in my hand and found the truth standing outside my own front door, soaked to the skin, holding on to the last of her dignity with both trembling hands. But that night hasn't come yet in the telling of this. Before I take you there, you needed to understand everything that led up to it. The promise I made in a hospital room, the debt of love I owed a woman who'd starved herself quiet so I could eat, the slow and deniable cruelty that crept into my house, one reasonable-sounding request at a time, and the small stack of secrets I'd already started collecting without yet understanding what they added up to. Because understanding, when it finally came all at once, in the rain, and by then it was almost too late to matter. The storm rolled in on a Thursday, the kind of storm the weather people had been warning about for 2 days, the kind that turns the sky the color of a bruise by 4 in the afternoon and makes the whole city feel like it's holding its breath. I remember standing at the window of my study, watching the first sheets of rain come sideways across the lawn, and thinking, absurdly, that it was a good night to be indoors with the people you loved. I didn't know yet how wrong that thought was going to turn out to be, or how much that phrase, the people you loved, was about to be tested in a way I never saw coming. My mother had been having a harder week than usual. The doctor had adjusted her medication after a follow-up appointment, and her body hadn't settled into the new dosage yet, which meant restless nights and a persistent tightness in her chest that worried me more than she wanted it to. Around 8 that evening, not long after the rain started coming down in earnest, she called me into her room, apologetic before she'd even finished the sentence, the way she always was whenever she needed anything from anyone. Her hands were shaking worse than usual. She said the tightness felt different tonight, sharper, and she thought, she wasn't sure, she didn't want to make a fuss, but she thought maybe her emergency inhaler, the one the cardiologist had prescribed alongside her heart medication for the breathlessness that sometimes came with her condition, might be empty. She checked. It was. I didn't hesitate. The nearest 24-hour pharmacy that carried her exact prescription was almost 30 minutes away even in good weather, and the storm outside was not good weather. But I looked at my mother's face, at the effort it was taking her, just to breathe evenly while she talked to me, and there was no version of that night where I was going to sit in my own dry house and wait for morning. I'm going to get it right now, I told her. Don't get up for anything. I'll be back before you know it. Winston, it's pouring out there. I've driven in worse. I hadn't. Not really. But I wasn't about to tell her that. I kissed her forehead, something I hadn't done since I was a boy myself being kissed goodnight. And I told her I loved her. And I told her to call the nurse's line if anything got worse before I got back. Then I found Celestine in the kitchen, told her where I was going and why, and asked her, I want this part remembered clearly, because it matters for everything that came after. I asked her directly to check on my mother while I was gone. Not once, repeatedly. I made her promise. Of course, she said, not looking up from the tablet in her hand. Go. I've got it handled. Those 4 words. I've got it handled. I would replay them in my head 100 times over the following days, turning them over like a stone with something ugly hiding underneath it, because I understand now that she meant something entirely different by them than what I understood in that moment. I thought she meant she would look after my mother. She meant she was finally going to handle a problem she'd been trying to solve for weeks. The drive to the pharmacy was worse than I'd imagined, visibility dropping to almost nothing in places, the wipers on my car working double time and still barely keeping up, other drivers crawling along with their hazards on like a funeral procession, moving through floodwater. I called ahead to make sure they had the inhaler in stock, sat in the parking lot for what felt like an eternity, while a pharmacist who moved with maddening slowness rang up my payment, and drove home even more carefully than I'd driven out, my knuckles white on the wheel, my mind running through best-case timelines. 45 minutes, maybe 50, not long, in the scheme of things. Not long enough, I told myself, for anything truly bad to happen. I want to tell you what was actually happening back at the house during those 45 minutes, because I didn't learn the full shape of it until later, pieced together from what Marbel saw, and what Celestine herself eventually admitted, under the weight of evidence she could no longer talk her way around. About 20 minutes after I left, Celestine went up to the guest suite. My mother, who had been lying down trying to breathe through the tightness in her chest, heard the door open and assumed, reasonably, that Celestine was checking on her the way I'd asked. Instead, Celestine told her that the storm had triggered some kind of electrical concern in that wing of the house, a story invented on the spot, we'd later confirm, because our electrical panel showed nothing unusual that night, and that she needed my mother to wait outside on the front step, just for a few minutes, just until the situation could be checked out, for her own safety. My mother, sick and trusting, and utterly unwilling to be any trouble to anyone, believed her. She got up, gathered her cardigan and her medicine bag, and the folder of discharge papers she still kept close out of habit, and let Celestine walk her to the front door. And then, according to what Marbel witnessed from the hallway upstairs, my wife stepped my 71-year-old mother outside into a thunderstorm, closed the door behind her, and turned the deadbolt. Marbel told me later that she nearly intervened right then, standing frozen at the top of the stairs, watching Celestine walk calmly back toward the sitting room, like she'd just taken out the trash, instead of locking a sick woman outside in a storm. Marbel said she called out, asked what was happening, and Celestine turned to her with an expression Marbel described as unnervingly composed, and said only, "She'll be fine. It's a few minutes. I need her to understand something." Marbel, employed in that house, dependent on that job, made a choice in that moment that she would carry guilt over for weeks afterward. She went to check on my mother through a window, instead of confronting her employer directly, saw Evelyn standing beneath the narrow overhang by the door, sheltered but shivering, and made the decision to call me, instead of physically intervening in a conflict between the man who signed her paycheck and his wife. My phone, soaked in my coat pocket from running to my car at the pharmacy, hadn't registered her call. I didn't know any of this was happening. I was driving home in the rain, thinking about nothing more than getting that inhaler into my mother's hands, completely unaware that she was standing outside my front door, in a hospital gown and an old cardigan, while the storm did its worst. By the time I turned onto our street, the rain had somehow gotten heavier, coming down in curtains that swallowed my headlights whole. I remember the specific, sick lurch in my stomach as I came up the driveway and saw a shape on the front steps that didn't belong there. Small, hunched, unmoving, except for the trembling that even the distance and the rain couldn't disguise. For one disoriented second, I thought I was imagining it. Then my headlights swept across her face, and I understood, all at once, with a horror that still visits me in dreams, that I was looking at my own mother. I don't remember getting out of the car. I remember being suddenly beside her, the rain instantly soaking through my shirt, my hands finding her shoulders, and finding them ice cold, finding her lips faintly blue at the edges, finding her whole body shaking in a way that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with a heart condition that was not built to withstand exposure like this. Her hospital bracelet was still on her wrist, the paper gone soft and translucent with rain. Her medicine bag sat on the wet stone beside her, the pill bottles inside ruined, the labels bled into illegible smears. Somewhere along the way, she'd dropped the blanket she must have grabbed on instinct, and it lay a few feet away on the ground, soaked through and useless. Winston. My name came out of her like it cost her everything she had left to say it. Your wife told me I was no longer welcome here. I don't have adequate words for what happened inside me in that moment. I've closed more deals, negotiated more high-stakes contracts, weathered more business crises than I can count, and none of it, not one single moment of my professional life, prepared me for the particular violence of that feeling. The floor of my entire understanding of my marriage, my home, my safety, dropping out from beneath me all at once. I got her inside as fast as I could, banging on the door I'd have sworn was never supposed to be locked against either of us, shouting for Marbel, wrapping my own jacket around my mother's shivering shoulders, half carrying her to the nearest chair, while I called for the nurse and dialed for emergency guidance in the same breath. Celestine appeared in the front hallway within moments, and I will remember the particular quality of her expression for the rest of my life. Not shock, not the horror a person shows when they discover something terrible has happened, but a kind of tight, defensive readiness, like she'd been waiting, almost expecting this confrontation, and had already rehearsed her lines. "Winston, I can explain. You locked her out." My voice came out of me lower than I'd ever heard it, a register I didn't recognize as my own. "In a storm, with her heart. You locked my mother out of my house." "I was protecting our home," she said, and even now, I don't know if she believed it when she said it, or if it was simply the sentence she'd prepared, the one she thought would land softest. "You don't understand what's been happening, what this whole situation has been costing us." I had a plan, I was handling it, and it was supposed to be 5 minutes, not 5 minutes. I heard my own voice crack on the words. "You left a 71-year-old woman with a heart condition, standing outside in a storm, and you're telling me about minutes." My mother, still shaking in that chair, still working to get her breath back under Marbel's careful attention, looked up at both of us with an expression I will never be able to fully describe. Not anger, though she had every right to it, but something closer to a terrible, quiet clarity. The look of a woman finally allowing herself to say the things she'd been swallowing for weeks, because she hadn't wanted to be trouble. "I didn't need a mansion, Winston," she said. So softly I had to lean in to hear her, over the rain still hammering the windows. "I only wanted to know my son still had room for me." Well, those words did something to me that I don't think I'll ever fully recover from, not because I want to recover from them, but because I think I need to carry them with me for the rest of my life, as a kind of permanent correction to who I'd let myself become. I had spent 20 years building a house with more rooms than any one family could ever fill, believing on some unexamined level that the size of what I could provide was the same thing as the depth of what I could give. And in the end, all my mother had ever wanted from any of it was to know there was room for her. Not square footage, not marble floors, not a guest suite with fresh linens. Room. The kind you make with your presence, your protection, your willingness to stand between the person you love and anything that threatens to push them out into the cold. I had failed her. Not through some single act of cruelty of my own, but through every quiet moment I'd let pass without asking harder questions. Every reasonable-sounding excuse I'd accepted, because challenging it felt harder than believing it. Every complaint Marbel had brought me, that I'd smoothed over instead of confronting head-on. I had promised my mother, in a hospital room weeks earlier, that she would never feel alone again, as long as I was breathing, and I had let her stand alone outside my own front door, in a storm, because I hadn't been willing to see clearly what my wife was capable of, until the evidence was standing there shivering in front of me. That night, once the nurse had confirmed my mother was stable enough to avoid a hospital return, but needed close monitoring through the night, once I'd gotten her warm and dry, and settled with more blankets than she probably needed, I finally asked Marbel to tell me everything. Not the polite, careful version she'd been offering me in pieces for weeks, out of loyalty to a household she depended on for her livelihood, but everything, all of it, without softening a single detail for my comfort. She told me about the phone calls in the garden, the ones she'd mentioned before but never fully explained. She told me she'd finally, out of growing concern, allowed herself to overhear enough of one of those calls to understand what they were about. Celestine speaking with the real estate attorney, whose name I'd found weeks earlier, discussing something Celestine kept referring to only as the property, pressing the attorney on how quickly a transfer or sale might be arranged if the current owner became, in Celestine's words, unable to manage her own affairs. Marbel told me about the meals quietly reduced, the walker relocated, the nurse visits cut, the chair moved away from the window, not isolated incidents of a woman adjusting poorly to a change in her household, but a deliberate, sustained campaign to make my mother feel so unwelcome, so much of a burden, that she would eventually choose to leave on her own, sparing Celestine the messier work of forcing the issue directly. And then Marbel told me the part that finally made the whole shape of it click into place, the part that connected the deed I'd found in that office weeks earlier to everything else that had happened since. My mother, it turned out, was the sole legal owner of a piece of land out near the county line, land that had been in our family for 3 generations, inherited from my grandfather, sitting quiet and mostly forgotten because my mother had never had reason to think of it as anything but a small, sentimental piece of property she paid modest taxes on every year. What none of us had known, what Celestine had apparently discovered through channels I still don't fully understand, some connection through her own family's business dealings, was that a regional development company had recently begun quietly acquiring land in that exact area for a project that would make that small, sentimental piece of property worth more money than my entire business had earned in the last 5 years combined. Celestine had found out before any of us, and rather than telling me, rather than bringing it to the family as the extraordinary piece of good news it should have been, she had begun working, quietly and methodically, to position herself to control that asset before my mother, or I, ever fully understood its value. If my mother stayed in our home, comfortable and cared for, and increasingly close to me, the odds of her eventually revising her will, of me becoming more involved in decisions about that land, of the truth coming out on terms Celestine didn't control, went up every single day. If my mother left, discouraged and hurt, and convinced she wasn't wanted, the odds of Celestine finding a way to quietly manage that situation to her own advantage went up instead. I sat with that for a long time after Marbel finished talking, feeling something in me go cold and still, in a way that felt almost like relief. The way it can feel almost like relief when a long, low fever of doubt finally breaks into a fact you can actually hold in your hands. My wife hadn't just been unkind to my mother, out of some petty discomfort with hospital equipment and medicine smells. She had been running a calculated campaign to protect a financial opportunity she'd deliberately kept hidden from her own husband, at the cost of the health and dignity of a woman who had sacrificed everything to raise me. I confronted her that night, after my mother was finally settled and sleeping under the nurse's watch, in the same kitchen where Celestine had once told me, "I've got it handled." I laid it all out, the phone calls, the attorney, the deed, the pattern Marbel had witnessed for weeks, the fact that a development company's interest in a piece of land my mother had owned quietly for decades was apparently worth more to my wife than my mother's own safety. I watched every excuse Celestine tried to offer collapse the moment it left her mouth, because there was no version of what she'd done that could survive contact with what I now understood. She tried anger first, accusing me of taking the housekeeper's word over my own wife's, of letting my guilt over my mother cloud my judgment the way, apparently, she'd been complaining to her sister about for weeks. When that didn't move me, she tried something closer to genuine desperation, telling me the land deal could set us up for the rest of our lives, that she'd only been trying to protect our family's future, that she would have told me everything eventually, once the details were finalized, once she was sure the opportunity was real. When even that didn't move me, she finally landed on something quieter, something that might have actually worked on me a month earlier, before I'd watched my own mother trembling in a rainstorm outside a door my wife had locked against her. She told me she loved me, that this was a mistake born of fear and financial pressure I didn't fully understand, that we could fix this together if I would just give her the chance. There is no together anymore, Celestine, I told her, and I felt the truth of that sentence settle into my chest with a kind of grief I hadn't expected, because some part of me had loved this woman for 11 years, and that part of me did not simply switch off because of what I now knew. You locked my mother outside in a storm to protect a real estate deal. I don't know what kind of person does that. I only know it's not someone I can keep sharing a home with. The days that followed were some of the hardest of my life, harder in some ways than the storm itself, because a marriage doesn't end in one dramatic confrontation. It ends in a slow, grinding series of practical unravelings, lawyers, boxes, difficult conversations with people who'd known us as a couple for years, and now had to be told, one by one, that the couple no longer existed. Celestine moved out within the week, into a rented condo across town, and the house that had once felt too large for even a family of 3 suddenly felt exactly the right size for 2, me and my mother. Finally, truly, without conditions attached to her welcome. I won't pretend the end of my marriage didn't hurt. It did. In ways I still feel some mornings when I wake up in a house built for a life that no longer exists in the shape I once imagined it. But grief for what was lost and clarity about what needed to end are not the same thing, and I have never once, not for a single day since, regretted choosing my mother over a marriage that had asked me, without ever saying it outright, to treat her as an inconvenience to be managed. Some choices look impossible until the moment finally arrives when they become the only choice a person with any decency left can make. My mother healed slowly, the way healing tends to go for a body that's been through as much as hers had, but she healed. The nurse's visits went back to 3 times a week, this time on my own insistence and without any quiet interference from anyone. I moved her chair back into the sunroom myself, positioned it exactly where she could watch the birds at the feeder for as many hours a day as she wanted, and I made sure, every single day, whether I was home for dinner or not, that she never once had to wonder again whether she was welcome in the only home either of us had left. We talked more in those months than we had in the previous 20 years combined. I asked her things I'd never thought to ask before, about the 4th job at the hotel, about the 2 hospitalizations she'd hidden from us as teenagers, about what it had actually felt like, all those years, to carry a family alone, and never let any of us see the weight of it. She told me things I'd never known, and I told her things I'd never said out loud, including how ashamed I was that it had taken a storm and a locked door for me to finally see clearly what I owed her, and how sorry I was that I'd let so many years pass, treating my success as a kind of down payment on a debt I'd never actually gotten around to paying. You paid it the day you drove through that storm for my medicine, she told me one evening, months later, sitting in that sunroom chair with color back in her cheeks and strength back in her voice. You paid it the day you chose me. A mother doesn't need every day to be perfect, Winston. She just needs to know that when it matters most, her child will choose her. You did that. Don't spend the rest of your life apologizing for the days before it. Spend it living out the days after. I took that to heart in a way that changed the direction of my entire life, not just my household. I found myself, in the months that followed, thinking constantly about all the other Evelyns out there, parents who'd sacrificed everything for children who'd grown comfortable enough to forget, elderly people discharged from hospitals with nowhere safe to land, families where love had quietly curdled into inconvenience the way it nearly had in my own house. I used a portion of that land sale because the development deal was real, and once it closed on terms my mother controlled entirely, on her own timeline, with her own lawyer, it did in fact change our family's financial future, just not in the way Celestine had once schemed to arrange. To establish a foundation in my mother's name, dedicated to supporting elderly parents who found themselves without safe places to recover after hospital discharges, without family able or willing to open their doors the way I nearly failed to open mine, in every way that actually mattered. We named it simply the Evelyn House, not a nursing facility, but a network of transitional support, short-term housing, home health coordination, legal advocacy for people whose families had quietly begun treating their care as a burden to be minimized rather than an honor to be carried. I stood beside my mother at the ribbon cutting for the first location, watching her cut that ribbon herself, with hands that had grown steady again, watching her smile in a way I hadn't seen since before my father died. And I understood, standing there, what she'd been trying to teach me my entire life, without ever once saying it as directly as that storm finally forced her to. I understand something now that took me 48 years and one ruined bag of medicine to learn. A house full of marble and glass is not the same thing as a home, not if the people who loved you first still have to wonder whether there's room for them inside it. Every dollar I ever made, my mother's hands made possible long before mine did, and for too many years I mistook paying her back with comfort for actually showing up. So I measure things differently now, not by what sits in an account or what my name is stamped on downtown, but by a much smaller, much harder question. Who would I never leave standing outside in the rain? That's the only ledger that ever really mattered. I'm just sorry it took a storm to teach me how to read it. If you've made it this far with me, thank you for staying. Comment, and let me know where in the world you're watching from. I'd genuinely love to say hello and know how far this story has traveled, and how many of you out there have your own Evelyn, waiting for you to finally choose them too.